Hey everybody, in this video we're going to be showing you how to paint a Steel Legion soldier for Conquest, The Last Argument of Kings by Para Bellum Wargames. Now, Conquest is a relatively new wargame which is all about fantasy combat in both skirmish mode and also a ranked mass battle mode. And it's something that's really captured my imagination because of the dark, moody atmosphere of it, which is absolutely beautiful and really shown in the artwork, but also, of course, in the miniatures as well, which are absolutely fantastic. Now, who are the Steel Legion? Well, they're a mercenary company who serve the 100 Kingdoms, who are the human faction in the game, and they're the remnants of an empire and are desperately trying to hold humanity together and stop them from devolving into feudal warlords who are all battling each other all the time. Now, I'm going to be painting it in the way that actually I've been painting my own army because this is the faction that's really captured my attention. And in this, as you'll see, we're going to be using lots of reds to kind of evoke that imperial feel. So we hope you enjoy it, and we'll see you at the desk. The soldiers of the 100 Kingdoms wear a lot of metallic armour across their bodies, and the Steel Legion are no exception with a lot of plate armour. And as Conquest is quite a dark fantasy game and very moody, I thought it'd be appropriate to paint this armour in a really dark metallic colour scheme. So that's what we're going to be going for here. And to do that, the first thing you need to do is to undercoat your miniature with an appropriate starting point. And in this case, I've gone for Mechanicus Standard Grey from Citadel, which is fantastic for this sort of thing, and it's going to be a great starting point for all the colours we're going to be using. But you could also use a metallic undercoat like a silver if you wanted to, or even a black. The choice really is yours. But the first colour you're going to need is some Iron Warriors, which is that dark silver. And to apply it, go for a large brush. I have here a monster brush from the Army Painter for this. And with this colour, what we need to do is just make sure we base coat all of that plate armour for that first step. So it doesn't matter about anything else at this stage. We are going to neaten up as we add further base colours to it. But to ensure we get a smooth coverage here, as ever, make sure you add a touch of water to the paint, thin it down a little bit, and then all you got to do is start blocking in all of that armour. So for example, I'm going to start in the middle of the body just here on the breastplate, and just want to make sure the colour's worked into all the little nooks and crannies as we go along, just painting all over like that. But as I say, it doesn't matter if you catch anything else, for example that padded armour just there, because we're going to come back to that later on. That's especially true when you get to the gauntlets, where there's these kind of bindings going around them, so just make sure you focus on getting all the silver parts of them, and we'll come back later on to neaten that up. Now at this stage, don't worry about painting the sword blade, because we're going to do a brighter silver so it stands out against the armour, so don't worry about that for the time being. With that base coat applied, the next thing to do is to apply a wash over the armour, because what I want to do is to darken down again. Remember that really dark armour plating to go with the feel of this universe. So what we want to do is create a kind of burnished appearance to the armour. And to do this, I'm going to get some Nuln Oil and some Agrax Earthshade and mix these two together to create a really dark brown wash. So ideal for the kind of effect I want here. And to get it ready, what you need to do is get hold of a large brush. I've got my monster brush once again. As a quick pointer, make sure you clean your water before starting this and make sure the brush is completely clean too. Otherwise you'll get metal flecks into the washes, and you really want to avoid that happening. But what we need to do is to make that roughly 50-50 mix here, and it doesn't have to be exact, just something in that ballpark is fine. So I'm just going to get a few brushfuls here of the black, and just one more for good measure. So there we go, and then I just need to create a roughly equal sized puddle next to it of Agrax Earthshade. So start out with 1 and 2 and 3, and that's looking about even. So I've got to mix those together to create that really dark brown. There we go, and with that prepared, it's just a matter of loading up with the brush and then applying it all over that plate armour. And what we're looking to happen here is it to run mostly into the recessed details, but you can see by just painting on it gives that definition and darkens down the flat plates as well. Now with this kind of quantity of wash, it will take a little bit of time to dry, so be sure to leave the miniature for about half an hour before moving on to the next stage. The wash is now completely dry, so we're ready to move on to the next step, which is actually going to be to brighten up the armour just a little bit, add a bit more of a shine back to it to give that metallic finish to it. I'm going to do it now before adding any other colours, because dry brushing is a perfect technique to use here. So I'm going to return to some Iron Warriors for this, and as I mentioned, I'm going to be dry brushing it on. I've got a small dry brush here from Citadel for this kind of thing, for a smooth dry brush on these details. All you need to do is get some tissue and use it to work a small amount of paint into the brush, getting rid of the excess of some tissue, just checking how it behaves in the texture. And when you're getting this kind of effect, you've got it around about ready. So once it's doing that, then all you need to do is start flicking this back and forth across the armour plating. And what we're looking for it to do is to leave a bit of a shine on the flatter areas. So you see, as I slowly build it up there like that, we're starting to get that slightly lighter metallic appearing on these flat panels and on the edges. So now it's just a matter of doing this all across that plate armour, bringing it up to around about this point before moving on to the next step. With that done, you can see we now got a bit of a shine back on the armour, but what we need to do is to start highlighting it by dry brushing once again. And again, this is the ideal time to do it because there's no other colours yet on the model, so we don't have to worry about catching anything else during this process. So for this, I'm going to use some Necron Compound, and this time I've actually switched to one of the hobby dry brushes from the Army Painter. That's because the bristles on this brush are a little bit stiffer than the ones on the Citadel one, so it makes it a bit more suited to the light kind of dry brushing I'm doing here, because this one's different to how we applied the previous colour. Rather than kind of catching some of the flat panels, I only want to catch the edges here. So this kind of brush is great for that sort of thing. And like before, you just need to work the paint into the bristles, but this time really make sure you get rid of most of that paint and just test it on the paper just to make sure there's hardly anything coming off. You see at this stage there's very little paint appearing there on that paper, so this is very good for what I want just here. And with this, it's just a matter of lightly flicking it back and forth across the armour. So much more emotion like this time, and you'll see what starts to happen is a brighter silver appears on the edges only of that plating. Now change the angle as you need to be going across those edges, so that central part of the breastplate, for example, you can see I've turned that way. I'm not going that way because then the paint will fall on either side, so just doing like that gets that nice highlight. So just change angle as you need to, working your way around that armour to get that highlight start to appear on the plating. With that dry brush done, you can see now we've got some highlights appearing on there, and I am going to return to that later on to add some finer highlights just to help all the armour plate pop. But before we do any of that, it's a good idea now to start blocking in some other base coats on the miniature to get a feel of the overall composition of things so that we're happy with that before we move on to any highlighting on anything really. So what we're going to do first of all is concentrate on the various colours of the fabrics, which are going to be the main colour scheme for this particular troop type and the overall force. Now in this case, these troops are Imperial troops who operate as mercenaries as well, so really could go for just about any colour you want here. But because of that Imperial background, and when you read the background of the story, the Imperial stuff often tends to feel a little bit Roman, I want these guys to have that slight Roman feel to them in their colour scheme. So for that reason, I'm going to go for deep reds, which are that classic kind of Roman colour. So I'm going to be starting out with Khorne Red, and with this I'm looking for the dominant fabrics on the miniature. But then after that we're going to look for some other tones. First of all, some Mephiston Red for the Plume, which is of course a different sort of material, but again red, so it builds into that Roman feel. After that I'm going to pick out some black fabric using some Corvus Black, and then we've got some fabric which forms some trim, and here I'm going to use some Zandri Dust. Now this again is going back to that Roman feel, because if you think of Roman shields, you've got the red and the gold on there. I'm going for a bright yellow here to be gold in this miniature. It'd be a bit too much, so instead I'm going for a more sandy kind of yellow, which is why I've picked out Zandri Dust for that. But first of all, I need that Khorne Red, which is a lovely deep red colour, and to apply it I'm going for a regiment brush here from the Army Painter. And all you got to do is, as ever, get some of this ready on your palette, thinning it down with that touch of water, and then it's just a matter of looking on the miniature for any parts that you want to have this colour on. And in this case I want it to be dominant, so I'm going to look at that padded armour that we've got underneath the armour plating. So primarily I'm looking at this sort of area here, and it's just a matter of blocking it in, being careful not to get this colour onto any of that silver. Now in addition, some of this appears on the sleeves around here on this side, so be sure to base coat in this sleeve at this stage as well. With that main fabric base coated, I'm now going to move on to some Mephiston Red, and this is for the helmet plume, and the reason why I'm using a different shade here is just to separate this from the fabric to show that it's a different material. But as before, you can really do this any colour you want. I'm just going for red because I want that Imperial feel. With the plume now base coated, the next colour I'm going to add is Corvus Black, and this is a secondary colour for fabric. So for example, these trails we've got coming down the front just here, I'm looking for areas like that, and again just base coat them with this colour. Now the reason why I've picked this black is because, as you can see, it's quite a muted colour really. It's a nice complement for that red and doesn't compete for attention with it, so it works really nicely alongside it there. Like that. Now I'm also going to paint these trails as well. At the same time, I'm looking for the sleeves kind of beneath this red sleeve just here. So just this little recess just there above the arm guard. And then finally, we're ready to pick out the trim using some Zandri Dust. And I'm looking for things such as the trim around this padded armour just here, and using a small layer brush now for a bit more control, I'm just going to be following that around. Taking advantage of it being raised up by using the side of my brush just to skim along it, just to catch that raised part there like that. Now, this appears on this part around here in this kind of zigzag pattern, but it's also on these trails that are coming down from the front that are painted with black. And with these, the motion's a little bit different. So angle the model so you're painting downwards in this kind of sweeping motion like this, using the tip of the brush and just follow it all the way down. Now if you do make any mistakes with this, don't worry about it, just neaten up with the other base coats before you continue on to the next stage. And there we are, all the different tones on the fabrics are now blocked in. And so for the next colour, what we're going to do is one more colour which forms quite a large part of the colour scheme here, which is going to be some brass detail. And here, I'm going to use some Balthazar Gold. But once that's done, what we need to do is to pick out the different shades of leather on there. And I'm going to go for 3 shades of brown here. Really can use any kind of brown you want for this. But I'm going to start out with some Dryad Bark, followed by some Gorthor Brown, and then finally some Doombull Brown. But first of all, we need Balthazar Gold, and to apply it, I'm sticking to that small layer brush, because with this, what I'm going to be doing is kind of working my way around the armour, just picking out details that I want to use to break up the silver a little bit and add some decoration to it. So there's no hard and fast rule as to what parts you should exactly do with this. But what I'm going to be doing with it is just making sure the paint's nicely thinned as ever and under control, and then I'm going to start looking for features that kind of stand out that we can use to, well, as I mentioned, break up all that silver. So for example, this symbol on the shoulder plate is a great example. I'm just going to block out this entire round marking on here, so all this part, but also I'm going to be looking elsewhere around the armour plating, and a really great example of this kind of thing for breaking it up is going to be this kind of collar we've got here, this gorget. So I'm going to pick this out as well, so all the way around here. I'm going to look for some details on the helmet as well, and these little round symbols on the side are a great feature to do for this kind of thing. And there's also some trim a bit further down as well. So on the groin plate, we've got this raised trim around here. I'm going to pick that out. And also these kind of plates that go on the side just here, these look like they stand out nicely, so I'm going to do these as well. Finally, this is a great colour for doing the detail on the sword to separate it from that armour plating. So I'm looking at the crossguard and the pommel, so all areas such as around here. I'm happy with the amount of bronze, so now I'm going to move on to the next colour, which is Dryad Bark, and this is for leather belts. So for example, there's these ones here on the backs of the knees, and also there's the ones on the forearms around here. With those straps picked out, we're now ready for some Gorthor Brown, and this is for the boots. So you can see all the way down here, as you're blocking this in, just be careful whenever you get close to the plating that appears around the feet. Just really take your time working the colour in between these areas. And then we're ready for a final tone for the leather, and this is Doombull Brown. It's quite a warm reddish brown, and this is for the grip of the sword. So we're looking at this part just here, the little bit that's visible just beneath the hand, and also this binding that's on top of the handguard just around here. With all those colours now blocked in, we can actually wash them all at the same time using the same shade, and a dark brown is ideal for all these tones. So I'm going to use some Agrax Earthshade on its own this time. I'm going to be applying it using a medium layer brush from Citadel, because here what we need to do is be careful not to get it onto that silver armour. It's basically everything else that we want to wash at this stage. So build up a little puddle on your palette so you can control how much is on your brush at once, and then once you've done so, all you've got to do is look for these details and just apply it over them. So for example, all the fabrics and also all the leathers and the brass too. Just paint it over so it's settled in the recessed detail and give some definition. That wash is now completely dry, and so we're ready for the next detail, which is actually the sword, because of course on the blade we've not done anything yet, and the reason for that is we just want to use a black wash on its own on the blade to make it appear clean. So what we need is a brighter silver than the armour, so here I'm going to use some Iron Hand Steel, and then for the wash I'm going to use some Nuln Oil. But first of all, I need that Iron Hand Steel, and I've gone back to my regiment brush to apply this. This is just a base coat on this area, so as ever with this kind of thing, all you got to do is make sure the paint's nicely thinned down, and once you've done so, it's just a matter of blocking in the entire blade. So we're looking at just above this leather collar just there, from these little kind of spikes we've got, and then going all the way up to the very tip, including this little recess that's just here. With that base coat done, the next thing to do is to apply a coat of Nuln Oil all over the blade, all the way up to the very tip, just making sure to be careful that it doesn't run down and collect a lot at the base of the sword. And there we are, the wash is completely dry on the sword, so now we can move on to the next phase, which is to do some layering on the miniature to start to brighten things up and neaten things up before we then move on to highlighting. And for this we need to start out with that red fabric, so Khorne Red, because this is the dominant colour besides the armour that we painted onto the miniature. And to apply it this time, I'm using the medium layer brush from Citadel for a bit more control than what we had initially. Because now what I'm looking to do is to spot those darker lines from where all that wash settled and basically avoid those parts and paint the other parts aside from it. So for example, if we take a look at the padded armour that we've got around here, you can see it's got this kind of like diamond pattern on there, and the shade is sort of settled in the recessed parts in between each of these raised areas. So what I'm looking to do is just to paint this colour onto the flat raised areas, such as just there, and skip past the recess and carry on again on the other side. With that layering done to the red, you can see now it's much brighter and cleaner, and so we just need to do this to one more of the fabric colours, which is going to be the Zandri Dust trim, just to make it a little bit neater looking. And once that's done, we're then going to lay it as well on the sword blade to make it nice and shiny and stand out, and for this we're going to return to Iron Hand Steel. But first we need that Zandri Dust, and this time I'm going to switch to a small layer brush for a bit more control than what we had on the red, because of course when we were base coating this trim, you've seen it's quite delicate to get to this part, so we need that loss control with that finer brush with that fine point on it. So just get the paint ready, as ever, thin down on your palette so it's nice and smooth. And then what we're looking to do is to retrace our steps. Now, because there's not quite so much in the way of recesses to look out for here, it's really just kind of layering directly over the top of what we did before. But because we've got that base colour there already, you'll find this is very quick and easy to do, and the colour takes to it very fast. So now it's just a matter of just working our way around that trim just to make it neater and cleaner. With that trim now nice and neat, we can move on to layering the sword blade using Iron Hand Steel. And the middle part of it is actually recessed, and we need to keep the definition on either side of that. So here, what we're looking to do is just to paint some silver straight down the middle of the blade, not going quite into those corners. And then after that, there's the cutting edge too, and on this we just want to make sure we layer the whole area so it's nice and shiny. And with that layer applied to the sword, you'll have a much shinier finish to the blade. And so with that done, we can now move on to the next stage of painting the model, which is to do the highlights here. And I'm going to start out with that silver armour. Remember earlier on we did dry brush it, so there is a subtle highlight there, but I want it to pop a little bit more. So I'm going to do an edge highlight now using some Stormhost Silver to give a real sharp finish to all of it. Now if you want to do this, what you'll need is a really fine brush. So go for a small one here. I'm using a detail brush from the Army Painter. And to do this technique, really the main trick of it is to get the paint thinned correctly on your palette. You essentially got to find a sweet spot where it flows well off your brush, but not so well that it flows out of control, and it requires a bit of a balancing really. What you should do is get some onto the palette and then get a little bit of water on your brush and introduce it into it next to it on the palette like that, drawing in more of the paint, because this way, if it's too thin like it is just there, then you can just add a bit more pigment if you want to, and if it becomes too thick, you can always get a little bit more water out of the pot and start again. But really what you're looking for is to get it to about this sort of consistency here, so that once you start painting it onto the palette, just try some lines, you'll see it flows very well from your brush. Now I've certainly got way too much paint on my brush right now because you can see it's leaving quite thick lines, but it's flowing well, so I'm happy with that. So what we need to do to get it ready is just get rid of the excess paint off your brush, load up fresh, and this way you'll have a fine tip and much more control as to where it's going to be going. So with this prepared, what I'm looking to do now is to identify all those sharper edges on the armour plating. And what I'm going to be doing is just running across those to pick them out. So for example, first of all, I'm looking for the really sharp edges like the shoulder pauldron just here. And using the side of the brush, holding it about 45 degrees from the flat, I'm just going to skim along using the side of those bristles. And this way I get a really neat edge highlight really quickly and really easily. Now the trick to this particular part of the technique is just to make sure that you're comfortable as you're approaching it with your hand. So I'm right-handed, so I'm looking to approach in this kind of angle, which means sometimes I'm going to have to turn the model around in strange ways to reach those parts, such as this other pauldron just here. I can get those parts quite easily, but when I'm going underneath it, I'm going to have to turn the model on its side so that I'm comfortable and have that control so I can follow along that area just there. Now you won't always be able to apply the paint quite in that way because sometimes the edges just aren't in the right place and it's a little bit awkward to get to. For example, these parts just here because the arm's in the way. In this case, just turn the model so you're painting downwards towards yourself and using the tip of the brush, just look for that edge and just very carefully follow along the edge of it. So just along there, working your way down in that smooth motion to get the highlight along that part. Now this will be the longest stage of painting the miniature, but it is the one that's really going to make all the armour pop out. So definitely take your time here, be as neat as you can and you'll get a really nice result. And with that highlight applied to the armour, you can see it's all standing out really clearly now. And I did the exact same thing on the sword at the same time to give a sharp edge to that cutting edge. And well, what we need to do now is the same thing on the brass details to make sure they all match in and it all looks right together. So here, we need some Liberator Gold, and the application is going to be identical to what we've just done. So back to the same brush, still using that detail brush from Army Painter. And with this, all you got to do is prepare the paint in just the same way that we did before, just testing to make sure it's nice and smooth, flowing well from the brush, and then just checking to make sure there isn't too much on the brush so it doesn't go out of control. And once you've got that ready, it's just a matter of looking for those brass details and picking out the edges of them. So for example, this little decoration we've got down here, just using the side of your brush just to skim along that raised area and that corner to get a nice highlight going along there like that. Now in addition, at this stage, there's a little bit more to do on the sword because there's actually some decoration on this kind of leather collar that's partway up the blade. And to do this, all we've got to do is very carefully use the side of the brush just to pick it out. And it's this sort of almost a sunburst kind of pattern just there. There's a little kind of rivet just beneath it just there. And also there's a little bit of banding just partway up the blade along here. And with that, the bronze detail is now standing out nicely as well, and so we can move on to highlighting the other colours in the miniature. And we're going to start out with those reds. Now, remember, I went for red on this miniature, but if you've gone for other colours, you'll just want to pick some appropriate highlights to whatever it is that you chose to do. But in this case, what we need, first of all, is some Wazdakka Red, followed by some Squig Orange for that deeper red. Then for the brighter red and the plume, we need some Evilson Scarlet, followed by Wild Rider Red. But first we need Wazdakka Red, and I've switched now to a small layer brush from Citadel for this. And what I'm looking to do with this is to pick out the raised details, creases, anything like that on that deeper red part that we painted in. So the padded armour mainly. And so for this, like before, just make sure the paint's nicely thinned down and that you've got that good point on your brush, and just test it on the palette to see how well it's flowing. That's behaving really nicely, so I'm happy with that. And then first of all, I'm looking at that padded armour, and you can see it's kind of a diamond pattern going on here. So to paint something like this, what I recommend you do is angle the model so you're painting downwards for each of these highlights, and just kind of work down each one at a time. So there, we want to just get a little bit on that one there as well, and then move on to the next one, working your way down like that. And once you've gone all the way around, then just change the angle and repeat on the next angle. So again, just working your way down each one of these pads. Now in addition, there's a little bit of this red showing through on the sleeve just there, so I'm going to highlight that too by just going around the edge of it, so just around there. With that highlight applied, we're then going to move on to adding a fine highlight using Squig Orange, and on the padding this time it's just on the top parts of it, so we're looking at just on that side there and on this side there, but the application technique is exactly the same as what we did in the previous stage. With that, the deep red is now complete, and so we can move on to that brighter red on the plume. And here I've got some Evilson Scarlet, and with this what I'm looking for is the edges of the texture of these kind of strands coming out. So using the side of your brush, just skim along them just to catch those edges to get a neat highlight running down them there like that. And finally, to complete the plume, we just need some Wild Rider Red, and this time when applying it, just be a little bit lighter as we paint it on, just aiming towards the ends and the strands that are sticking out. So just there, for example, and just along the top right here. And with that, all the red is now complete, and we're ready to move on to the final stage of highlighting the remaining details. And here, first of all, to highlight that trim, what we need is some Ushabti Bone, and then after that we need to do all the leathers. So here we'll start with some Gorthor Brown, then we're going to use some Baneblade Brown, and finally a small amount of Tuskgor Fur. But first we need Ushabti Bone, and to apply it again I'm going to use that small layer brush. And with this, what we're looking for is those defined features on the trim we painted earlier on using Zandri Dust. So, like before, just make sure the paint's nicely thinned down and flowing well from your brush, and then we're looking for those parts. So for example, the kind of zigzag trim we've got on the red details just there, what I'm looking to do on the lower edge, on the hem of it, is to use the side of the brush like an edge highlight and just kind of work my way around like that to get that neat highlight following all along that edge. Now for the inside edge, it's a little bit trickier, but you can also apply the paint in the same way. Just really brace your hands so you're nice and steady. I'm actually going to be using the side of the brush right next to the tip just to very carefully get that part right there. Now if you're struggling to get the angle right, remember you can always hold the model so you're painting downwards towards yourself, and this way just follow that edge down like that. The choice really is yours as to how exactly you apply it. Now that trim is highlighted, all we've got to do is to highlight the leather to finish off the model. I'm going to start out with the dark leather using some Gorthor Brown. What we need to do is look for those edges and again pick them out. So straps such as on the back of the leg just there behind the knee, and just following on either side. And then we've got these straps on the forearms too, and for these all you got to do is look for the strap and follow the angle down, just making sure just to skim that edge to get a highlight running along those areas. With that dark leather done, we're now ready to move on to Baneblade Brown, and this is for the detail that we base coated with Gorthor Brown earlier on. So we're looking at the boots here, and again we're looking for defined edges and details that stand out. For example, just on the toes around here, and you can see there's a few little wrinkles up here. So I'm just looking for the tops of those. I'm just going to follow along them very, very carefully. So just along there, for example. And finally, we just need a small amount of Tuskgor Fur, and that's to highlight the leather collar that goes around the sword. And again, we're just looking for the sharper edges, which in this case are going to be following the cutting edge of the blade all the way down. Now with this done, your miniature is ready to be based, and as ever, it's entirely up to you how you base it, but for this one, I'm going to go for a grasslands base. And here we have the completed Steel Legion soldier, ready to wield his great sword in defense of humanity. So with miniatures like this, where there's lots of plate armour, it's actually a very good idea to paint quite a lot of this very early on, because this way you can use lots of techniques like dry brushing to get some really nice highlights on there very quickly and very easily. And once you've done all that, it's just a matter of blocking in all those remaining details. And this is a method that can be taken over to many of the different figures and many of the different games, especially when lots of plate armour is involved. So have fun painting your miniatures, and we'll see you all again very soon.